Okay. Thanks for sticking with us here. I know you've got a marathon of press conferences, but we're happy to have you here. This is the Climate Action Network International Press Conference. My name is David Turnbull. I'm the director of the Climate Action Network. We're a network of 700 organizations around the world in 95 countries working together to promote solutions to the climate crisis. Today we've got 3 speakers here to give you an update on these talks and some homework that we'd like to see countries pursue and lead up to the next negotiations. First we'll have Alden Meyer with the Union of Concerned Scientists, then we'll have Tova Riding from Greenpeace International, and finally Tasneem Essop from WWF International. Alden.
Thank you, David. We all are clear on what we want out of Durban. It's on the cover page of ECO today. You can see it. We need an ambitious package. It needs to have multiple elements. First and foremost, and the foundation stone of this, is a clear commitment by industrialized countries to go ahead with a second commitment period under the Kyoto Protocol. We also need pledges to meet the commitment they made in Cancun to close the gap between the 2-degree Celsius temperature limit they politically agreed to and the 3 to 4 degree reality of the track that we're on now with the current level of ambition and pledges. We need to close that gap and have a strategy to close that gap. We can't wait until the 2013 to 2015 review to do that. Obviously, we've got to have agreement on the whole package of so-called MRV, measurement, review, and verification issues, which includes very politically explosive ones, such as reporting by major developing countries. But that can be done. That can be worked out with good political will. We need agreement on operationalizing the new financial mechanism that was launched in Cancun, the Green Climate Fund, how that's going to be governed, how it's going to be overseen by a standing committee in this process, and most importantly, start the discussion about long-term finance beyond the current so-called fast start financing that countries committed to out of Copenhagen, which, as people should note, runs out at the same time as the current Kyoto Protocol commitment, December 31st of 2012. As we said in ECO yesterday, as of January 1st, 2013, the current amount of dollars pledged is 0 from developed countries. That gap needs to also be closed starting in Durban, and serious discussions of long-term innovative sources of finance that can generate the 100 billion target by the end of this decade need to be on the table. Obviously, we also need to operationalize the other Cancun mechanisms, the adaptation framework, the technology mechanism. There are a whole host of things agreed to in principle in Cancun that only have life if they reach a separate set of decisions in Durban to operationalize them. And then last but not least, we need a mandate coming out of Cancun for a parallel negotiation on a legally binding framework to complement the Kyoto Protocol. Because we know that to meet the level of ambition that we need to reduce emissions, to have certainty and trust among parties, we need to broaden both the depth and the breadth of those that are under that kind of agreement. We've had extensive debates in Copenhagen and since, including at this meeting, on parties' views on various legal forms that that agreement could take. We're calling on parties to rise above their differences and commit to launch a process to reach agreement on that within a date certain coming out of Cancun. And politically, that is clearly needed to give the Kyoto Protocol industrialized countries the confidence to move ahead on Kyoto. So this is a political package. These are the key elements of it. In terms of the parties, what we need is leadership from the European Union. Toby's going to talk more about that, but they need a partner in the G77, including the basic countries and some of the progressive middle-income countries, the Africa group, the AOSIS group, and others. They need a partner to move ahead on this kind of package and reach a political agreement in Durban. We need the 3 major countries that are talking about pulling out of Kyoto to reconsider, Japan, Russia, and Canada. As we noted in ECO today, it's ironic that those 3 countries include the country that hosted the Kyoto meeting and was the presidency, the country that provided the ratification vote that made Kyoto enter into force, and the country that hosted the COP that launched this process of negotiating the second commitment period. It would be ironic if the 3 countries that gave birth to designing, ratifying, and extending Kyoto are the 3 countries that try to pull out and kill it. So we're calling on them in no uncertain terms to reconsider and come to Durban prepared to reverse that position. And finally, there's my country, the United States, which has made clear it's not in Kyoto. But that's one of the reasons we need a second-track negotiation of a legally binding instrument that is comparable to Kyoto in terms of ambition, in terms of review and compliance, and in terms of the rules and standards in it, so that the U.S. long-term is not let off the hook. So that's the sort of the political homework. In terms of the state of play, you've been at this meeting and watching it. I think we have been making progress on a technical level in a number of fronts, and the facilitators of the contact groups have done a tremendous job at compiling parties' views and illuminating the issues. Hopefully they will have a resume session in September or October. I guess we'll find out more on that tonight. Parties all seem to want it to progress their work. South Africa is going to do a variety of meetings that Tasneem can say more about in the Q&A session, about trying to have a political leadership and ministerial discussions that can lay the groundwork for a decision in Durban. So there is hope there. It's all to play for. The rumors that this process is dead in the water or over or no longer relevant, I think, are greatly exaggerated. But it's all at stake. The next 3 or 4 months and the lead up to Durban are going to make all the difference about whether we're on the upswing and maintain the multilateral regime that this process has created over the last 15 years or see it all wither away.
Thanks, Alden. Next we have Tova Riding with Greenpeace International.
Thank you, Alden. Thank you, David. Yes, I will say something about the European Union, and the first thing I will do is respond to some of the things that they said in their press conference. One thing in particular, they said, we will continue to act as a driver, and that's a very important point. When the EU gets in the back of the bus and screams for someone to take the wheel, it's not the same thing as being a driver in this process. Of course, we have countries like Canada that suggest that we should drive backwards. So in that context, of course, the EU is better than Canada, but they are not being a driver in this process at the moment. They could be. And a few suggestions as to how the EU could help drive this process forward and show some leadership. The first one is, of course, to increase the target to 30% domestically. At the moment, the EU is suggesting that they will reduce their emissions by 20% compared to 1990 by 2020. Now, they've already reduced their emissions with 17%, so they're suggesting that over the next 10 years, they'll reduce 3% more. That's not climate ambition, that's not climate leadership. And in this context, it's also important that they start moving away from the perception that this is about sharing pain and this is a burden. I mean, the EU's own analysis actually show that there are many opportunities for this, in this for the EU in terms of jobs, in terms of saving expenses for fossil fuels, in terms of health benefits, in terms of generally making the economy fit for the future. So there's generally a change in perception needed in the European Union. The second thing they could do is change their tactics. At the moment, EU is bluffing in these negotiations, and everyone can see it. They are claiming that they are only willing to reduce their emissions by 20% at the moment. However, their own analysis shows that if they actually carry out the initiatives they have on the table at the moment, they will end up at 25%, and everyone knows this. So this kind of bluffing, this kind of climate poker, we do not have time for it, and it doesn't help the negotiations forward. And thirdly, they can actually give a clear explanation to the developing countries as to what they need to enter into a second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. We understand that the developing countries have asked very clearly, EU, what do you need? However, they have not gotten an answer yet, so we need a clear answer from the EU on that one. So, as you can hear, there's a lot of homework for the EU coming out of this session, and therefore it's a good thing that the European ministers are meeting next week. However, there's a lot of discussion about what they are to produce there, and some countries have suggested that the discussion about whether to move to 30% should be kicked forward, not only to the fall session of the European Union's meetings, not only to the winter session, but all the way to 2012. And of course, this would be a completely awkward signal to send when they sit here and claim that they are driving this process forward. Of course, they need to put this issue on the agenda and make a decision to increase their ambition to a level that reflects the reality and what they can actually achieve. And finally, they also pointed out that we did give them the ray of the day, and they're absolutely right about that. We were very happy about the EU's efforts for increasing transparency in this process, for opening up the doors so we can see what's going on. Unfortunately, we couldn't give the EU the ray of the day for climate leadership and ambition yet. When they start showing some leadership in this process, I'm pretty sure that we will have a ray of the day for them once more.
Thanks, Tova. Finally, we have Tasneem Mehsab from WWF.
Thanks, David. And just following on with the theme of leadership, as we know, this process started off pretty slowly. We're happy that in the second week it did pick up pace. We, however, still feel that we need to speed the process up a bit. And Alden's given us a bit of an overview about what is needed between now and Durban and what we're expecting in Durban. And what concerns me is the lack of leadership even on the part of developing countries. And while we know that developing countries have done much up to now in terms of their pledges, in terms of committing to domestic actions, and we've had Oxfam's analysis of what that looks like in comparison to industrialized countries, that does not let developing countries off the hook. In fact, what we would really like to see is that we stop with all the procedural squabbles that's holding up the process. It starts off whether it is, of course, substantive issues behind an agenda fight, but it can end up like today that we're having arguments about what is an INF document versus a MIST document. These issues are procedural matters, and a process like this cannot be held up by those petty squabbles. And I would suggest that leadership, therefore, from the developing countries would be to keep the eye on the ball, to keep looking at what is needed in Durban to prevent this risky gamble that both Tove and Alden have spoken about, that we're actually risking the process and the entire multilateral process if we don't come out with that kind of balanced package that Alden spelled out earlier. So Durban is critical, and the developing countries have put very firmly on the table their demand for a second commitment period under the Kyoto Protocol. That is a very big political ask, and it would also therefore require the political will on the part of developing countries to say what they're going to be putting on the table. And therefore we believe that they clearly have to prepare for political compromise. One of the key things that can be offered, of course, is a comparable arrangement under the convention track that also ties in developing countries, while all the countries who are not in the Kyoto Protocol, into a legally binding agreement as well. Many developing countries would probably still resist that because we find that the debate is still polarized, but we believe the time is ripe for that kind of mandate to be taken in Durban, and we call on the G77 plus China, having taken the initiative to open up the dialogue with especially the EU, that they are going to be pretty flexible in their positions and look at where the compromises need to be made. The big elephants in the room have to be dealt with, otherwise we will find ourselves in Durban still dealing with those big political issues, the legal options that we need to decide on, the issues of finance that still needs to be decided on, and then the broader issues of transparency and ambition. So we really do believe that the G77 can rise up and meet the need for political leadership, and that they can actually assist in saving the future of this process. Short-term, narrowly defined national interest will only lead to a sabotaging of the process, and we call on all countries to try and understand that we need to keep the focus on saving the planet and its people, and Durban is critical for that.
Thanks very much. We have time for questions. Yes, Art.
Arthur Max from AP. We just had Christiana in here talking about the working towards a global mitigation framework, linking the Kyoto Protocol with the convention, and that doing that is going to require high-level political intervention. Number one, it would be nice to hear what that means in English. Number two, given the history of the attempt by political leaders to get involved here, just your comment about whether at this stage what could be accomplished, and could it be accomplished in a brief meeting, for example, at the General Assembly, on the sidelines of the General Assembly?
Yeah, I'll take the first cut of that. I didn't see Christiana's press conference, but it sounds very compatible with the vision that we were laying out, that you have to continue the Kyoto Protocol, the second commitment period. That's the foundation stone of this whole regime. But you need to complement it with, as Tasneem said, legally binding action by other countries, including the United States, including the major emitter developing countries. And you need to launch a process in Durban that produces that, and that's the political deal to get the Kyoto Protocol extended, is there needs to be a venue and a forum to talk about the rest of the world and bringing them into some comparable kind of arrangement. That doesn't mean comparable in terms of level of action, to be clear. It doesn't mean that we're calling on developing countries to take binding, quantified limitation commitments for emissions for their whole economy the way the Kyoto parties does. But it does mean the similar kind of agreement in terms of transparency, in terms of review, in terms of commitment to meeting pledges they carry out, and that should be what's on the table. That, is going to be a discussion because I think long term we see merit in heading towards the single legal framework that a number of the Kyoto countries that are talking about getting out of Kyoto say they want. I think we all want that, but you don't jump out of one ship before you've designed the other one, and that's what Japan, Russia, and Canada are talking about. We're saying stay in the Kyoto ship. That's the one we know. It's solid. It works. It has to be improved. The level of ambition needs to be deepened, and we need to be designing another vehicle that can broaden and carry the load down the road in this process, hopefully not too far in the future. That's the political package. Whether the political will is there, I think, is the right question. Clearly there were commitments made in Cancun that need to be followed through on, and that's both on closing the gigaton gap. It's on meeting the level of ambition on finance of the developed countries committed to in Copenhagen and then elaborated more in Cancun. It's on meeting the 2-degree Celsius temperature limit that we're gravely in danger of overshooting as we speak. Whether the General Assembly process can be used to help facilitate that. I know South Africa is thinking about convening heads of state around the margins of the GA session. Tasneem may know more about that than I do. That's not the place for the negotiations, obviously, as we saw in Copenhagen. You don't want the heads of state at this point trying to negotiate the deal, but sending political signals and demonstrating political commitment to get an ambitious deal in Durban would be very helpful. Because in these halls and in Bangkok, we've seen negotiators start to fall back a little bit to tried and true and somewhat stale negotiating positions and backing away from some of the understandings that the ministers reached in Cancun to move forward. So heads of state, political leaders can add value to this process and give an impetus to their negotiators and their ministers to come together and reach the deal that we talked about in Durban.
Any additional questions? Yeah, please.
Stephen Minnis, Climate Spectator. Tasneem, you talked about narrow national interests potentially sabotaging this process. I wonder, in light of Qatar and Saudi Arabia's interventions last night on loss and damage, are we starting to see that play out in that item and potentially in other items? Thank you.
That's one of the examples of what I would call narrow national interests. We're really looking at the risk of a number of issues that we would have thought were simple and easy enough to be moved along quite quickly in the process, being held hostage by those narrowly defined national interests. So as Alden says, there were issues that were progressed in Cancun. An example of an issue we thought would be progressing quite rapidly would be RED, and it appears as if that's also not progressing. So we're really worried about a number of these issues that could be, agreed to by Durban being held up and held hostage by national interests.
Any additional questions?
Ben Sills from Bloomberg. I just wonder, could you give us an update what the latest situation is as far as funding an additional meeting, an intersessional between now and Durban is? And it strikes me as kind of odd that that isn't taken as a given. Maybe I'm just kind of slightly new to this. And could you kind of just explain a little bit about what's going on there, what that reluctance perhaps signifies? Thanks.
Well, I'll start and others can chime in, and we don't have complete transparency on this. I do understand that Christiana will be speaking at the AWG-LCA plenary, which Dan Reefsnyder announced will hopefully reconvene around 6:30 tonight, once they've worked out some issues that they were just talking about in that contact group. And she will provide an update on the status of that. My understanding is the total budget for the session, including participation by developing country negotiators, is somewhere around $6.9 million. As of today, they're about $1 million short of that, is what I've been told by negotiators. She'll obviously give us a fuller view of that, but we don't have all the funding in hand that we need. That seems a pretty ridiculous issue to not have a session that all parties agree is needed to reach an ambitious outcome in Durban. My colleague Pat Finnegan from Ireland in another context was talking about the increase in the Secretariat budget for the next couple of years that also was a big sticking point and finally was resolved when the European Union gave in to the compromise by the chair of the SBI earlier today. And there the amount being requested, I think it was somewhere in the area of $2 or $3 million a year. And Pat said, well, that's the equivalent of laying 100 meters of new roadway in Ireland. And for that, we're willing to risk the ability of the Secretariat to help us save the planet. I mean, and climate is going to destroy those roadways anyway as they buckle from heat and coastal erosion. I mean, this is insane. But that's the state of play in these debates. And part of it is, I think, a little negotiating ploy by some of the industrialized countries, because some of the statements last week and earlier this week is, well, we're interested in the session, but we don't know the value of it until we see how this week plays out. And so they were clearly trying to signal that if you're going to play these kind of agenda negotiating fights that we had in Bangkok and in the SBs last week, we may not fund additional sessions, because why come and fight about the agenda for a week in Bangkok again? So there's a lot of negotiating back and forth going on here. But my sense is, I've been watching this for a little while over the years, is that they will reach agreement and have the money in hand. It may not be tonight, but by the deadline Christiana's talking about next week, I think they will come up with that extra money and there will be a session. My understanding also, it's most likely to be in Bangkok, not Panama, but we'll see on that too.
Thanks, Alistair from Reuters. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what still needs to be resolved today. Is there anything that could cause people to stay here all night, or is hopefully not? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just in the LCA, and for those of you who are shut out of that process because you're not observers, exalted observers like we are, we get shut out of other meetings, but you get shut out of some too. What the state of play is there, the main issue now is two things. One is I'll come back to, which is the MISC versus INF. The biggest one is that Dan Reefsnyder tabled a list of 6 submissions by countries, topics for submissions by countries before the resumed session in the fall, and I believe 3 technical products or technical papers by the Secretariat. And these were coming out of each of the working groups, and they basically looked at the ones that they thought had consensus, where there wasn't disagreement on whether or not it was a good idea, and they compiled a list. There are now closed negotiations going on with interested parties about that list. Both about whether what's on the list is right and acceptable and worded correctly, and whether there are things off the list that need to be added. In the developing countries, we're talking about wanting to add in technical papers on registries and technical papers on facilitating support of projects through NAMAs, through nationally appropriated mitigation actions. A whole host of things countries were suggesting, but these clearly were things that did not cross the bar of consensus in the individual working groups over the course of the last 2 weeks, and that's why the Secretariat didn't propose them. That could be the one thing that could hold it up. The second thing that could hold it up is that Dan Reefsnyder made very clear that he would come back with a proposal for the organization of the work of the session in what's called a scenario note on his own authority sometime before the resume session in the fall. The good news is it'll be a resume session, which means they won't have to fight over the agenda because they'll just be continuing with the agenda they agreed to for this session. They'll suspend this session, come back in. But there's still got to be a way to organize the 6 days. And he made clear there's not going to be things piggybacked onto it outside of that sessional period. It's all going to have to be squeezed into the 6 days. And, of course, a lot of countries want workshops on that, technical groups on that. They've got all the contact groups established here they have to work through. There's a lot of work to do in those 6 days. Whether they will give him the authority on his own basis, consulting with the facilitators and working with the Secretariat to propose how to do the work when they come back together will be another test tonight. I hope they will, because if they don't, it's basically a vote of no confidence in the chair, and then where do you go? I mean, I think they have to give him that authority to do it. Those are the two things that could hold up. If they don't reach agreement on this list of submissions and work products by the Secretariat, or they don't agree to give him the authority. This MISC versus INF thing, I mean, MISC documents are where submissions by governments are usually listed, and INF documents are where things like scenario notes or reports of facilitators on contact groups are assembled and compiled. Neither of them have legal status as negotiating text. Neither of them has priority over the other, but they spend a lot of time in there arguing about what should go where. Today, I said to Dan Reefsnyder after we left the meeting that maybe we should consolidate them and have an IF document. If you put ambitious text in here, we can save the planet, and just put up with this food fight. But he laughed, but I don't think he's going to propose that because that would be overturning decades of well-established UN procedure. But that's not a big fight. I think the two are the list of submissions and technical papers and giving him authority to design the next session. Those are the things that could keep us here well into the evening or early morning.
Thanks. Maybe one final question? Okay, well, thanks very much. We'll be watching closely, and I'm sure my speakers here are happy to speak with you on the side as well. Thanks.